Why do we forget who we were? The question, as old as the mystery of death itself, echoes in research labs, churches, and the restless minds seeking to understand what really happens when life ends, or perhaps begins anew. Elisabeth Kübler-Ross, the Swiss-American psychiatrist who revolutionized the way the world talks about death, dedicated her life to observing the threshold between two worlds, that of the living and that of those who are departing. In her countless encounters with terminal patients, she noticed something that transcends medical study, a pattern, a vague memory, a sense of having been here before. But if these impressions are real, why don't we clearly recall our past lives? Kübler-Ross believed the answer lay less in biology and more in the spiritual function of forgetting. For her, the human soul carries profound wisdom, but also a mechanism for protection. Forgetting is a way to start over, she said in her lectures in the 1980s. It wasn't about punishment, it was about mercy. She observed that during near-death experiences, the so-called NDEs, many people reported a kind of life review, a film of themselves, lived with an indescribable clarity. In these visions, they understood not just what they did, but why they did every act, every emotion. And yet, upon returning to life, most of these memories would dissipate. The psychiatrist saw in this an indication that there is, between one existence and another, an interval of learning, a space where the spirit assimilates what it has lived before plunging back into the human experience. Forgetting would thus be a pedagogical pause, a kind of necessary veil so that the next life is not just a continuation, but an opportunity for evolution. In conferences in Germany, Switzerland, and the United States, Kübler-Ross spoke without religious dogma. She brought science and spirituality together with an almost disconcerting clarity. She cited the work of Ian Stevenson, the Canadian psychiatrist who investigated hundreds of cases of children who remembered past lives with verifiable details. She acknowledged the seriousness of his research, but noted that spiritual memory, when it exists, can be selective. According to her, to remember everything would be like living with the weight of 1,000 lives on one's shoulders. The human mind, which is limited to the brain, could not support the volume of experiences accumulated by an eternal consciousness. Forgetting, then, would be the mechanism that allows the soul to continue evolving without the burden of the past. While 20th century science tried to measure death in heartbeats and brainwaves, Kübler-Ross invited the world to view it as a passage, and forgetting as part of the same process. Thus, the initial question remains: do we forget by chance or by necessity? When Elisabeth Kübler-Ross spoke about the forgetting between lives, she didn't treat it as a memory lapse, but as a mechanism of transition. For her, dying was not the end. It was merely a change of state, similar to the act of falling asleep and waking up on another plane of consciousness. In her studies and interviews with terminal patients, she observed that as people neared death, something changed in the way they perceived time and identity. Many reported feeling larger than their personal histories, as if the self they were leaving behind was only a part of something vaster. When we understand that we are not the body, the fear of death disappears, she used to say. But why then, upon returning to a new life, if that truly occurs, don't we bring the full memory of that understanding with us? Kübler-Ross proposed an answer that united neuroscience and spirituality. The soul's memory is different from the brain's memory. The brain, she asserted, is just an instrument, a temporary tool. Consciousness, on the other hand, is the invisible musician who uses it to express their experience. When the instrument is swapped, when a new body is born, the melody starts anew, but the musician remains the same. She saw a form of balance in this. The soul retains the essential lessons: empathy, compassion, courage, but leaves behind the emotional weight of old pains. If we remembered every mistake, every loss, perhaps we wouldn't withstand the cycle of new beginnings. Forgetting, Kübler-Ross would say, is the soul's anesthetic before the next surgery of growth. During a conference in Hamburg in 1984, a woman asked her if it would be possible, through hypnosis, to recover memories of past lives. Kübler-Ross replied calmly, "It might be, but ask yourself, what would you do with that information? The important thing is not who you were, but what you are doing now with what you have learned." This response summarized her ethical view of reincarnation. The past serves evolution, not curiosity. Ian Stevenson, whom she admired, arrived at a similar conclusion through a different path. His cases of children who recalled names, places, and even birthmarks corresponding to deceased people suggested a continuity of consciousness. However, Stevenson also observed that these memories tended to fade with age, as if the veil of forgetting closed again naturally. Kübler-Ross saw in this phenomenon a proof that forgetting is intentional, part of a larger process. Childhood, she said, is the period when the spirit is still adapting to the new clothing. Afterward, the new personality solidifies and the previous memories fade, much like writing on the sand that the sea collects at dusk. For her, it's not about denying the past, but about allowing the present to have meaning. Life is a school, she often said, and forgetting is the sign that a new lesson has begun. Elisabeth Kübler-Ross often said that forgetting is an act of mercy. Not just a biological mechanism, but a compassionate gesture from nature itself, a protection against the weight of memories that could trap us in cycles of pain. For her, recalling all past lives would be like carrying 1,000 biographies in a single human heart. It would be unbearable. During her decades of work with terminal patients, she realized that memory is selective even at the moment of death. People don't relive everything. They relive what is essential. That which needs to be understood, forgiven, healed. This life review, described by hundreds of patients, is not a chronological rerun, but a spiritual synthesis. According to Kübler-Ross, this process is how the soul reorganizes the learning before moving on. She therefore viewed forgetting as part of a cosmic pedagogy. If the spirit recalled everything, there would be no room for discovery. Life would lose the freshness of direct experience. The purpose of incarnation is to live love again, not just remember it, she said in a lecture in Zurich in 1986. This idea fits surprisingly well with Ian Stevenson's observations, though he was more restrained in spiritual terms. Stevenson recorded that children with past life memories exhibited a decline in those recollections over time. As they grew and adapted to the new family, the memories diluted. For Kübler-Ross, this was precisely the sign that the natural process was working, the soul reintegrating into the new existence, letting the past rest. She also believed that forgetting prevents spiritual vengeance, a kind of natural justice that protects human relationships. If we remembered who hurt us in another life, she said, we would bring the old wars into the new families. Forgetting, therefore, would be a shield against the repetition of the same conflicts, a pause so that love has a new chance to flourish. Kübler-Ross saw love as the only element that truly crosses the boundaries between lives. Everything else, names, faces, cultures, beliefs, is transitory. Love is the only energy that is not lost, she affirmed. Therefore, forgetting doesn't destroy significant bonds, it merely purifies them. In her view, when we meet someone with whom we've had a deep connection before, we feel an unexplained familiarity, a kind of silent recognition. It would be the echo of the spiritual memory that survives the conscious mind. This understanding, both scientific and poetic, gave new meaning to the initial question. We don't remember because it would be dangerous to remember too much. We forget because we need to start over, free from the weight that would prevent us from loving again. In one of her last interviews, given in 2001, Kübler-Ross summarized this idea simply: the soul knows, but it doesn't tell. because the learning needs to happen through practice, not through remembrance. For Elisabeth Kübler-Ross, understanding why we forget past lives required distinguishing two types of memory: the memory of the mind and the memory of the soul. The first belongs to the body, is chemical, limited, and dissolves with brain death. The second, she said, is energetic, a field of consciousness that records not only facts, but intentions, emotions, and lessons learned. During her years of research and accompanying terminal patients, she heard descriptions that seemed to exceed any traditional psychological model. People who, at the edge of death, reported floating above their body and observing everything clearly, recalling details later confirmed by witnesses. Kübler-Ross called this expanded perception of consciousness. For her, it was evidence that the deepest self was not trapped in the brain. But if the soul holds everything, why doesn't the human mind access this information at birth? The explanation she proposed was elegant and compassionate. The new brain is like a blank book given to the same author. The previous story is stored in another volume, closed on the shelf of eternity. Reopening all the books at once would confuse the learning. One must concentrate on the current chapter. Kübler-Ross compared forgetting to childhood. No child recalls the womb, birth, or the first few months, and yet the body develops on invisible foundations. Similarly, the spirit continues its development, guided by implicit memories, transformed into talents, tendencies, fears, or unexplained affinities. What we call instinct, intuition, or déjà vu would be, according to her, subtle traces of this spiritual memory. In 1987, during a seminar in Frankfurt, she recounted a case that deeply affected her. A young nurse who had witnessed dozens of deaths in an oncology hospital confided that she felt an unexplained connection with an elderly terminal patient. "It was as if I already knew her," the nurse said. Shortly before dying, the patient held her hand and whispered, "Thank you for coming back." Kübler-Ross reported the episode as an example of how the soul recognizes, even if the mind doesn't comprehend. The psychiatrist also observed that forgetting can be breached only when there is a therapeutic necessity. In cases of deep trauma, for instance, certain memories emerge as symbolic fragments, dreams, or phobias without apparent cause. Ian Stevenson documented such situations. Children who had intense fear of weapons or water corresponding to causes of death in previous lives. Kübler-Ross saw this as the unconscious trying to integrate an pending lesson, an emotional settling of accounts between lives. For her, spiritual evolution is a continuous process of recalling the essential without retaining the superfluous. Forgetting is selecting. The soul chooses what should be remembered as wisdom and what should be left as the past. In her words, the human mind was not made to contain the infinite. That is why love is the only memory that survives death, because it is simple, pure, and light enough to cross all boundaries. Elisabeth Kübler-Ross believed that the forgetting between lives is not just a natural phenomenon. It is a spiritual treatment. The soul, she said, goes through a process of healing between one incarnation and another, similar to a patient's rest after surgery. It is in this interval that the being analyzes what they lived, understands their choices, and then prepares for a new experience. Forgetting would be the anesthetic that allows this new birth without pain. In her lectures during the 1980s and 1990s, Kübler-Ross reported that many people who underwent near-death experiences described a state of absolute comprehension, a moment of total lucidity, as she defined it. In that dimension, time ceased to exist, and everything became pure learning. However, when they returned to physical life, this memory dissipated, leaving only the sensation that everything made sense. For Kübler-Ross, this spiritual amnesia was essential. If the soul brought to the body all the consciousness of the beyond, the earthly experience would lose its purpose. We need to forget in order to feel again. she observed that human suffering is often linked to attachment. Remembering past lives, therefore, could reinforce these ties, perpetuating old guilt, resentment, or fears. Forgetting acts as a veil of protection. It is what allows us to love again without prejudice, to trust again without carrying the history of disappointments from other existences. In 1985, during a symposium in Heidelberg, Kübler-Ross was asked about past life regression, a practice that was becoming popular. Her response was thoughtful. It can be useful in therapeutic contexts when done with respect and purpose, but it is dangerous to turn it into curiosity. Remembering without being ready is like opening a wound that has not yet healed. This view placed forgetting on the same level as forgiveness, a natural and necessary process for the balance of the soul. She also spoke of forgetting as an instrument of humility. If every human being remembered the greatness they had already lived, their achievements, their powers, their influences, they might lose themselves in arrogance again. Not remembering is what keeps us learners. Life is a cycle of letting go, she said. The truly wise person is not the one who remembers everything, but the one who accepts to start over. Kübler-Ross saw Earth as a school of empathy. Each life would be an opportunity to develop different aspects of the same consciousness. We forget not because we were punished, but because learning requires total immersion. If we knew from the beginning who we were, we wouldn't value what we are discovering now. This approach does not deny reincarnation, but places it in a context of universal compassion. Ian Stevenson, while avoiding spiritual interpretations, found the same pattern in his research. Children who remembered past lives did so for reasons linked to healing: reconciliation, acceptance, release from traumas. After the learning was fulfilled, the memory disappeared. Kübler-Ross saw in this evidence of love as a therapeutic force. Forgetting for her is an act of love, from the soul to itself. It clears the ground so that the new can flourish. The soul doesn't erase the past, she said. It transforms it into silent wisdom. Elisabeth Kübler-Ross described human existence as a journey between two worlds, the physical and the spiritual. Between these two planes, she said, there is a veil, a thin border that not only separates but protects. This veil is forgetting. Without it, the crossing between lives would be chaotic. We cannot carry the luggage of all our existences, she explained at a conference in Basel in 1990. Each new life is a small suitcase, packed only with what will be useful for the next journey. This metaphor summarized well what Kübler-Ross saw in her terminal patients. As death approached, many reported visions of deceased family members, of parents, children, or partners who came to welcome them. For her, these reunions were real, but also symbolic, a kind of partial, filtered memory. The spirit did not access everything at once because the emotional shock would be immense. The same principle, she affirmed, applies to birth. The soul, upon entering a new body, crosses the veil and temporarily forgets who it is, to be able to start anew. She said that this veil is not a punishment, but energetic protection. It serves to ensure that the human experience is lived with authenticity. Life would lose its meaning if we remembered we were in a kind of rehearsal, she often joked. Forgetting is what makes emotions real, suffering felt, and love earned again. During an interview given to German public radio, Kübler-Ross commented that forgetting also protects the freedom of the spirit. If everyone remembered past lives, they would be trapped by old identities, with no space to create new versions of themselves. Forgetting is the first step towards spiritual freedom, she stated. There is no evolution without detachment. She also mentioned an interesting physiological aspect. The human brain, especially in the first years of life, is biologically designed to forget. Neural connections are constantly reorganizing, erasing millions of pieces of information that are not essential to survival. Kübler-Ross saw in this a reflection of the wisdom of the universe itself. "Nature teaches us to forget to survive," she said. "The same happens with the soul. It needs to forget to evolve." Ian Stevenson, who closely followed her in the field of reincarnation research, shared a similar observation. Many of the children he studied, especially in India, Lebanon, and Thailand, showed emotional confusion when reliving intense memories. They remembered the previous family, felt longing, rejected the new home. Stevenson saw in these cases proof that memory, when not mediated by forgetting, causes suffering. Kübler-Ross interpreted this as further evidence of the therapeutic function of the veil. The soul doesn't forget because it wants to hide. It forgets because it wants to heal. Ultimately, the veil is an act of love from consciousness upon itself, a pause between acts, a silence before the new symphony of life. Kübler-Ross once concluded, "The veil is proof that the universe is compassionate. It allows us to be born again without fear, to love again without resentment, and to learn again without the weight of the past." Among Elisabeth Kübler-Ross's most daring ideas was that forgetting is not imposed, but chosen. According to her, the soul, before reincarnating, actively participates in the preparation of its next life, and the act of forgetting is part of this choice. "We didn't come to Earth to remember, but to experience," she said firmly at a conference in Vienna in 1989. "Remembrance belongs to eternity. Living belongs to time." This view emerged from her observations of people who had near-death experiences and described a state of amplified consciousness where they had access to total wisdom. In these experiences, the individual felt deeply connected to everything, to the universe, to other souls, to unconditional love. But upon returning to the body, everything was erased, leaving only a feeling of peace and purpose. Kübler-Ross interpreted this as a reminder that forgetting is deliberate. The soul knows what it needs to forget to be able to act again. She believed that, between lives, the soul reviews its trajectory with spiritual guides, beings who don't judge but merely help understand. In this state, the spirit recognizes what it has learned and what it still needs to develop: patience, humility, forgiveness, courage. Then, it chooses a new body, a new culture, a new family, and finally chooses to forget. Forgetting would thus be an agreement for freedom. It ensures that the new experience is lived without interference from old memory, like a blank page where learning can be rewritten. Kübler-Ross compared this process to the cycle of the seasons. The soul, after harvesting the lessons of autumn, sleeps in the winter of forgetting to bloom again in the spring of a new life. "Nothing is lost," she said. "What was love remains. The rest returns to the earth to be transformed." During a seminar in Freiburg, a psychology student asked her, "But if forgetting is chosen, why do some remember and others don't?" Kübler-Ross replied, "Some need to remember to heal, others need to forget to live." This simple and precise sentence summarized her entire philosophy. She recognized that remembering can be necessary when something is unfinished, a trauma that needs to be understood, a relationship that needs to be healed. In these cases, the veil lifts just enough to allow the learning. That's why, according to her, certain children recall fragments of previous lives, while most remember nothing. It's not chance, it's purpose. Ian Stevenson saw this same pattern in his studies. He observed that memories surfaced, almost always, in contexts of violent or sudden death. Kübler-Ross explained this in a complementary way. When death is abrupt, the soul sometimes crosses the veil without time to comprehend. Then, in another life, it tries to conclude the interrupted story. In her last lectures, Kübler-Ross reinforced that forgetting is a conscious gift. The soul forgets because it trusts. It trusts that love will be found again, that learning will be resumed, that pain will be transformed. Forgetting is an act of faith in eternity itself. For Elisabeth Kübler-Ross, the forgetting of past lives was not a mystery to be deciphered, but a necessary condition for us to be human. In her words, it is the silence between the notes that creates the melody. Likewise, forgetting is the interval that allows the soul to express itself again, in a new key, in a new body, in a new life. In her final conferences, already frail, she spoke with serenity about the importance of this silence. She said that life, without forgetting, would be a continuous sequence, without breaks, without time to mature. The soul needs forgetting to breathe, she asserted. To remember everything would be like trying to live without ever sleeping. She observed that, in daily life, this same principle repeats itself. We forget small offenses, old fears, old pains, and by forgetting, we heal. The soul does the same on a larger scale. Forgetting is the spiritual breath of the universe. It is what allows love to be reborn clean, without the shadow of the past. For Kübler-Ross, forgetting does not mean ignorance, but trust. The soul trusts its own path so much that it accepts to dive into the unknown, knowing that nothing essential is lost. We don't need to remember love to live it again, she said. It is in us, even when we forget its name. In one of her most reflective texts, she wrote, "Forgetting is the most generous act of the Creator. It allows us to be born again without the pain of old scars. It gives us the chance to start over as if it were the first time, and in a way, it is." She believed that when the soul completes its cycle of learning, the veil finally dissolves. At that point, remembering and understanding become the same thing. There is no longer a need to forget because there is no more fear, no more guilt, no more separation. Total love replaces memory. It is the state she called full consciousness of eternity. Ian Stevenson, until the end of his life, maintained a cautious stance. His scientific investigations into spontaneous memories of past lives provided material that intrigued the academic world. Kübler-Ross, however, complemented this approach with a human and perhaps spiritual dimension that the scientific method could not reach. She did not seek to prove reincarnation, but to understand what it revealed about compassion and the purpose of life. In the final years of her journey, speaking in universities and hospitals, she invited listeners to reflect not on the past, but on the now. "If we forget, it's because the present is enough," she said. "Eternity is contained in every act of love, and love is the only memory that never fades." Today, as we revisit her words, we understand that the question is not why we forget, but what for. Forgetting is the sacred space where the soul is reborn in freedom. It is the interval between two existences, the silent instant in which consciousness chooses to keep growing. And perhaps it is precisely this silence, this not remembering, that makes us truly human. Beings who love, learn, err, and start over, always believing that, behind the forgetting, there is a greater purpose waiting to be remembered.